Okay, let's see, chapter 7, 117 to 124. I'm going to do these pages real fast. Let me take a little pre-reading sip. Okay. The road to revolution. Victory in the 7 Years' War made Britain the master of a vastly enlarged imperial domain in North America. But victory, including the subsequent need to garrison 10,000 troops along the sprawling American frontier, was painfully costly. The London government therefore struggled after 1763 to compel the American colonists to shoulder some of the financial costs of the empire. This change in British colonial policy reinforced an emerging sense of American political identity and helped to precipitate the American Revolution. The eventual conflict was by no means inevitable. Indeed, given the tightening commercial, military, and cultural bonds between colonies and mother country since the first crude settlements a century and a half earlier, it might be considered remarkable that the Revolution happened at all. The truth is that Americans were reluctant revolutionaries. Until late in the day, they sought only to claim the rights of Englishmen, not to separate from the mother country. But what began as a squabble about economic policy soon exposed irreconcilable differences between Americans and Britons over the cherished political principles. The ensuing clash gave birth to a new nation. The deep roots of revolution. In a broad sense, America was a revolutionary force from the day of its discovery by Europeans. The New World nurtured new ideas about the nature of society, citizen, and government. In the Old World, many humble folk had long lived in the shadow of graveyards that contained the bones of their ancestors for 1,000 years past. Few people born into such changeless surroundings dared to question their social status. But European immigrants in the New World were not so easily subdued by the scowl of their superiors. In the American wilderness, they encountered a world that was theirs to make afresh. Two ideas in particular had taken root in the minds of the American colonists by the mid-18th century. One was what historians call republicanism. Looking to the models of the ancient Greek and Roman republics, exponents of republicanism defined a just society as one in which all citizens willingly subordinated their private, selfish interests to the common good. Both the stability of society and the authority of government thus depended on the virtue of the citizenry, its capacity for selflessness, self-sufficiency, and courage, and especially its appetite for civic involvement. By its very nature, republicanism was opposed to hierarchical and authoritarian institutions such as aristocracy and monarchy. A second idea that fundamentally shaped American political thought derived from a group of British political commentators known as radical Whigs. Widely read by the colonists, the Whigs feared the threat to liberty posed by the arbitrary power of the monarch and his ministers relative to elective representatives in the Parliament. The Whigs mounted withering attacks on the use of patronage and bribes by the king's ministers, symptoms of a wider moral failure in society that they called corruption, in the sense of rot or decay. The Whigs warned citizens to be on guard against corruption and to be eternally vigilant against possible conspiracies to denude them of their hard-won liberties. Together, Republican and Whig ideas predisposed the American colonists to be on hair-trigger alert against any threat to their rights. The circumstances of colonial life had done much to bolster these attitudes. Dukes and princes, barons and bishops were unknown in the colonies, while property ownership and political participation were relatively accessible. Americans had also grown accustomed to running their own affairs, largely unmolested by remote officials in London. Distance weakens authority. Great distance weakens authority greatly. So it came as an especially jolting shock when Britain, after 1763, tried to enclose its American colonists more snugly in its grip. Mercantilism and colonial grievances. Britain's empire was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness, an old saying goes, and there's much truth in the jest. Not one of the original 13 colonies, except Georgia, was formally planted by the British colonies. All the others were haphazardly founded by trading companies, religious groups, or land speculators. The British authorities nevertheless embraced a theory, called mercantilism, that justified their control over the colonies. Mercantilists believed that wealth was power, and that a country's economic wealth, and hence its military and political power, could be measured by the amount of gold or silver in its treasury. To amass gold or silver, a country needed to export more than it imported. Possessing colonies thus conferred distinct advantages, because the colonies could both supply raw materials to the mother country, thereby reducing the need for foreign imports, and provide a guaranteed market for exports. The London government looked on the American colonists more or less as tenants. They were expected to furnish products needed in the mother country, such as tobacco, sugar, and ship's masts, to refrain from making for export certain products, such as woolen cloth or beaver hats, to buy imported manufactured goods exclusively from Britain, and not to indulge in bothersome dreams of economic self-sufficiency, or worse, self-government. From time to time, Parliament passed laws to regulate the mercantilist system. The first of these, the Navigation Law of 1650, was aimed at rival Dutch shippers trying to elbow their way into the American carrying trade. Thereafter, all commerce flowing to and from the colonies could be transported only in British, including colonial, vessels. Subsequent laws required that European goods destined for America first had to be landed in Britain, where tariff duties could be collected and British middlemen could take a slice of the profits. Other laws stipulated that American merchants must ship certain enumerated products, notably tobacco, exclusively to Britain, even though prices might be better elsewhere. British policy also inflicted a currency shortage on the colonies. Because the colonists regularly bought more from Britain than they sold there, the difference had to be made up in hard cash. Every year, gold and silver coins, mostly earned in illicit trade with the Spanish and French West Indies, drained out of the colonies, creating an acute money shortage. To facilitate everyday purchases, the colonists resorted to butter, nails, pitch, and feathers for purposes of exchange. Currency issues came to boil when dire financial need forced many of the colonies to issue paper money, which swiftly depreciated. British merchants and creditors squawked so loudly that Parliament prohibited the colonial legislatures from printing paper currency and from passing indulgent bankruptcy laws, practices that might harm British merchants. The Americans grumbled that their welfare was being sacrificed for the well-being of British commercial interests. The British Crown also reserved the right to nullify any legislation passed by the colonial assemblies if such laws worked mischief with the mercantilist system. This royal veto was used rather sparingly, just 469 times in connection with 8,563 laws, but the colonists fiercely resented its very existence, another example of how principle could weigh more heavily than practice in fueling colonial grievances. The merits and menace of mercantilism. In theory, the British mercantile system seemed thoroughly selfish and deliberately oppressive, but the truth is that until 1763, the various navigation laws imposed no intolerable burden, mainly because they were only loosely enforced. Enterprising colonial merchants learned early to disregard or evade troublesome restrictions. Some of the first American fortunes, like that of John Hancock, were amassed by wholesale smuggling. Americans also reaped direct benefits from the mercantile system. If the colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country, it was hardly less true that Britain existed for the benefit of the colonies. London paid liberal bounties to the colonial producers of ship parts over the protests of British competitors. Virginia tobacco planters enjoyed a monopoly in the British market, snuffing out the tiny British tobacco industry. The colonists also benefited from the protection of the world's mightiest navy and a strong, seasoned army of redcoats, all without a penny of cost. But even when painted in its rosiest colors, the mercantile system burdened the colonists with annoying liabilities. Mercantilism stifled economic initiative and imposed a rankling dependency on British agents and creditors. Most grievously, many Americans simply found the mercantilist system debasing. They felt used, kept in a state of perpetual economic adolescence, and never allowed to come of age. As Benjamin Franklin wrote in 1775, "We have an old mother that peevish is grown. She snubs us like children that scarce walk alone. She forgets we're grown up and have a sense of our own." Revolution broke out, as Theodore Roosevelt later remarked, because Britain failed to recognize an emerging nation when it saw one. The stamp tax uproar. Victory-flushed Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War holding one of the biggest empires in the world, and also, less happily, the biggest debt. Some 140 million pounds, about half of which had been incurred defending the American colonies. To justify and service that debt, British officials now moved to redefine their relationship with their North American colonies. Prime Minister George Grenville first aroused the resentment of the colonists since 1763 by ordering the British Navy to begin strictly enforcing the navigation laws. He also secured from Parliament the so-called Sugar Act of 1764, the first law ever passed by that body for raising tax revenue in the colonies for the Crown. Among various provisions, it increased the duty on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. That was awfully written. Among various provisions, it increased the duty on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. After bitter protests from the colonists, the duties were lowered substantially, and the agitation died down. But resentment was kept burning by the Quartering Act of 1765. This measure required certain colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. Then, in the same year, 1765, Grenville imposed the most odious measure of all, a stamp tax, to raise revenues to support the new military force. The Stamp Act mandated the use of stamped paper or the affixing of stamps, certifying payment of tax. Stamps were required on bills of sale for about 50 trade items, as well as on certain types of commercial and legal documents, including playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, bills of lading, and marriage licenses. Grenville regarded all of these measures as reasonable and just. He was simply asking the Americans to pay a fair share of the costs for their own defense through taxes that were already familiar in Britain. In fact, the British people for 2 generations had endured a stamp tax far heavier than that passed for the colonies. Yet the Americans were angrily aroused at what they regarded as Grenville's fiscal aggression. The new laws did not merely pinch their pocketbooks. Far more ominously, Grenville also seemed to be striking at the local liberties they had come to assume as a matter of right. Thus, some colonial assemblies defiantly refused to comply with the Quartering Act, or voted for only a fraction of the supplies that it called for. Worst of all, Grenville's noxious legislation seemed to jeopardize the basic rights of the colonists as Englishmen. Both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act provided for trying offenders in the hated Admiralty courts, where juries were not allowed. The burden of proof was on the defendants, who were assumed to be guilty unless they could prove themselves innocent. Trial by jury and the precept of innocent until proven guilty were ancient privileges that British people everywhere, including the American colonists, held most dear. And why was a British army needed at all in the colonies, now that the French were expelled from the continent and Pontiac's warriors crushed? Could its real purpose be to whip rebellious colonists into line? Many Americans, weaned on radical Whig suspicion of all authority, began to sniff the strong scent of a conspiracy to strip them of their historic liberties. They lashed back violently, and the Stamp Act became the target that drew their most ferocious fire. Angry throats raised the cry, "No taxation without representation." There was some irony in the slogan, because the seaports and tidewater towns that were most wrathful against the Stamp Act had long denied full representation to their own backcountry pioneers. But now the aggravated colonists took the high ground of principle. The Americans made a distinction between legislation and taxation. They conceded the right of Parliament to legislate about matters that affected the entire empire, including the regulation of trade, but they steadfastly denied the right of Parliament, in which no Americans were seated, to impose taxes on Americans. Only their own elected colonial legislators, the Americans insisted, could legally tax them. Taxes levied by the distant British Parliament amounted to robbery, a piratical assault on the sacred rights of property. Grenville dismissed these American protests as hair-splitting absurdities. The power of the Parliament was supreme and undivided, he asserted, and in any case the Americans were represented in the Parliament. Elaborating the theory of virtual representation, Grenville claimed that every member of Parliament represented all British subjects, even those Americans in Boston or Charleston who had never voted for a member of Parliament. Sorry, I just crunched some ice. The Americans scoffed at the notion of the virtual representation, and, truthfully, they did not really want direct representation in Parliament, which might have seemed like a sensible compromise. If they had attained it, any gouty member of the House of Commons could have proposed an oppressive tax bill for the colonies, and the outvoted American representatives, few in number, would have stood bereft of principle with which to resist. Thus, the principle of no taxation without representation was supremely important, and the colonists clung to it with tenacious consistency. When the British replied that the sovereign power of government could not be divided between legislative authority in London and taxing authority in the colonies, they forced the Americans to deny the authority of Parliament altogether and begin to consider their own political independence. This chain of logic eventually led, link by link, to revolutionary consequences. Forced repeal of the Stamp Act. Colonial outcries against the hated Stamp Act took various forms. The most conspicuous assemblage was the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, which brought together in New York City 27 distinguished delegates from 9 colonies. After dignified debate, the members drew up a statement of their rights and grievances and beseeched the King and Parliament to repeal the repugnant legislation. The Stamp Act Congress, which was largely ignored in England, made a little splash that time in America. Its ripples, however, began to erode sectional suspicions, for it brought together around the same table leaders from the different and rival colonies. It was one more halting but significant step toward intercolonial unity. More effective than the Congress was the widespread adoption of non-importation agreements against British goods. Woolen garments of homespun became fashionable, and the eating of lamb chops was discouraged so that the wool-bearing sheep would be allowed to mature. Non-importation agreements were in fact a promising stride toward Union. They spontaneously united the American people for the first time in common action. Mobilizing in support of non-importation gave ordinary American men and women new opportunities to participate in colonial protests. Many people who had previously stood on the sidelines now signed petitions swearing to uphold the terms of the consumer boycotts. Groups of women assembled in public to hold spinning bees and make homespun cloth as a replacement for shunned British textiles. Such public defiance helped spread angry resistance throughout American colonial society. Sometimes violence accompanied colonial protests. Groups of ardent spirits, known as Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty, took the law into their own hands. Crying liberty, property, and no stamps, they enforced the non-importation agreements against violators, often with generous coat of tar and feathers. Patriotic mobs ransacked the houses of unpopular officials, confiscated their money, and hanged effigies of stamp agents on liberty poles. Shaken by colonial commotion, the machinery for collecting the tax broke down. On that dismal day in 1765, when the new act was to go into effect, the stamp agents had all been forced to resign, and there was no one to sell the stamps. While flags flapped at half-mast, the law was openly and flagrantly defied, or rather nullified. England was hard hit. America then bought about 1/4 of all British exports, and about 1/2 of British shipping was devoted to the American trade. Merchants, manufacturers, and shippers suffered from the colonial non-importation agreements, and hundreds of laborers were thrown out of work. Loud demands converged on Parliament for a repeal of the Stamp Act, but many of the members could not understand why 7.5 million Britons had to pay heavy taxes to protect the colonies, whereas some 2 million colonists refused to pay for only 1/3 of the cost of their own defense. After a stormy debate, Parliament in 1766 grudgingly repealed the Stamp Act. Grateful residents of New York erected a leaden statue to King George III, but American rejoicing was premature. Having withdrawn the Stamp Act, Parliament in virtually the same breath provocatively passed the Declaratory Act, reaffirming the Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The British government thereby drew its line in the sand. It defined the constitutional principle it would not yield: absolute and unqualified sovereignty over its North American colonies. The colonists had already drawn their own battle line by making it clear that they wanted a measure of sovereignty of their own, and would undertake a drastic action to secure it. The stage was set for a continuing confrontation. Within a few years, that statue of King George would be melted into thousands of bullets to be fired at his troops. The Townshend tea tax and the Boston Massacre. Control of British ministry was now seized by the gifted but erratic Charles, Champagne Charlie, Townshend, a man who could deliver brilliant speeches in Parliament even while drunk. Rashly promising to pluck feathers from the colonial goose with a minimum of squawking, he persuaded Parliament in 1767 to pass the Townshend Acts. The most important of these new regulations was a light import duty on glass, white lead, paper, paint, and tea. Townshend, seizing on a dubious distinction between internal and external taxes, made this tax, unlike the stamp tax, an indirect customs duty payable at American ports. Oh my god, I just burped so loud, excuse me. But to the increasingly restless colonists, this was a phantom distinction. For them, the real difficulty remained taxes, in any form, without representation. Flushed with their recent victory over the stamp tax, the colonists were in a rebellious mood. The impost on tea was especially irksome, for an estimated 1 million people drank the refreshing brew twice a day. Townshend revenues, worse yet, were to be earmarked to pay the salaries of the royal governors and judges in America. From the standpoint of efficient administration by London, this was a reform long overdue. But the ultra-suspicious Americans, who had beaten the royal governors into line by controlling the purse, regarded Townshend's acts as another attempt to enchain them. Their worst fears took on greater reality when the London government, after passing the Townshend taxes, suspended the legislature of New York in 1767 for failure to comply with the Quartering Act. Non-importation agreements, previously potent, were quickly revived against the Townshend Acts, but they proved less effective than those devised against the Stamp Act. The colonists, again enjoying prosperity, took the new tax less seriously than might have been expected, largely because it was light and indirect. They found, moreover, that they could secure smuggled tea at a cheap price, and consequently smugglers increased their activities, especially in Massachusetts. British officials, faced with a breakdown of law and order, landed 2 regiments of troops in Boston in 1768. Many of the soldiers were drunken and profane characters, liberty-loving colonists, resenting the presence of the red-coated ruffians, taunted bloody backs unmercifully. A clash soon erupted. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a crowd of some 60 townspeople began taunting and throwing snowballs at a squad of 10 redcoats. The Bostonians were still angry over the death of an 11-year-old boy, shot 10 days earlier during a protest against a merchant who had defied the colonial boycott of British goods. Acting apparently without orders, but nervous and provoked by the jeering crowd, the troops opened fire and killed or wounded 11 citizens, an event that became known as the Boston Massacre. One of the first to die was Crispus Attucks, described by contemporaries as a powerfully built, runaway mulatto and a leader of the mob. Both sides were in some degree to blame, and in the subsequent trial, in which future President John Adams served as a defense attorney for the soldiers, only 2 of the redcoats were found guilty of manslaughter. The soldiers were released after being branded on the hand. The seditious committees of correspondence. By 1770, King George III, then only 32 years old, was strenuously attempting to assert the power of the British monarchy. He was a good man in his private morals, but he proved to be a bad ruler. Earnest, industrious, stubborn, and lustful for power, he surrounded himself with the cooperative yes-men, notably his corpulent Prime Minister, Lord North. The ill-timed Townshend Acts had failed to produce revenue, though they did produce near rebellion. Net proceeds from the tax in 1 year were a paltry £295, while in that same year Britain's military costs in the colonies had mounted to £170,000. Non-importation agreements, though feebly enforced, were pinching British manufacturers. The government of Lord North, bowing to various pressures, finally persuaded Parliament to repeal the Townshend revenue duties. But the 3p toll on tea, the tax the colonists found most offensive, was retained to keep alive the principle of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The flames of discontent in America continued to be fanned by numerous incidents, including the redoubled efforts of the British officials to enforce the navigation laws. Resistance was further kindled by a master propagandist and engineer of rebellion, Samuel Adams of Boston, a cousin of John Adams. Unimpressive in appearance, his hands trembled, he lived and breathed only for politics. His friends had to buy him a presentable suit of clothes when he left Massachusetts on intercolonial business. Zealous, tenacious, and courageous, he was ultra-sensitive to infractions of colonial rights. Cherishing a deep faith in the common people, he appealed effectively to what was called his trained mob. Samuel Adams' signal contribution was to organize in Massachusetts the local committees of correspondence. After he had formed the first one in Boston during 1772, some 80 towns in the colony speedily set up similar organizations. Their chief function was to spread the spirit of resistance by exchanging letters and thus keep alive the opposition to British policy. One critic referred to the committees as the foulest, subtlest, and most venomous serpent ever issued from the egg of sedition. Intercolonial committees of correspondence were the next logical step. Virginia led the way in 1773 by creating such a body as a standing committee of the House of Burgesses? I don't know. Within a short time, every colony had established a central committee through which it could exchange ideas and information with other colonies. These intercolonial groups were supremely significant in stimulating and disseminating sentiment in favor of united action. They evolved directly into the first American Congresses. Okay, and that is 124. My throat hurts, so I'm gonna... Yay!